Don't worry about being too perfect with this. Our eye helps to make it feel correct, even if we're off. It's going to be a little bigger. Anything, can I see how to fix it? And by doing that, we create a shape within a shape, a nested shape. Well, let's build on last week's presentation of shape. Today, we're introducing a new shape, a couple of new shapes, and one of them is simple, the cup. The other is more complex, the teapot. And I'm also going to be talking a bit about shadows. And shadows, they go hand in hand with an idea of light. So let's start to think about that. Let's start with our basic shape as we warm up. The cup is a rather simple shape based on a cylinder, and a cylinder is based on a circle. What do I mean by that? If we look straight down into the cup, we're going to see a circle. This is what the potter sees when they look down as they're making the cup. They try to create a circle. But seldom are we drawing this view, almost never. Usually we're drawing a view that shows the profile of our cup. And the circle is still visible. The circle is now an ellipse. We remember that from last week in our plate. If we can see through the cup, this ellipse is going to be a little bigger. And the foot too has an ellipse. So everything is sort of rounded. The part that we see gets progressively deeper as it moves down the subject. This also has to do with some of the perspective that we talked about last week, our relationship to the object. So as our object approaches eye level, in this case right about here, this line is going to get flatter and flatter. So let's use the idea of the cylinder to understand a little better what I mean. So here's now it's basically a rectangle, but we're going to make it into a cylinder. And this part is at eye level. The top of our cylinder is at eye level. As we come down, it's going to get a little more open. So you can see how our eye level influences the openness of the ellipse. When you understand this idea, and I think it's pretty understandable with this graphic, then you start to see it in your subject, and you can bring it to your subject. So imagine that as we look down, it's getting more and more open. If we extend this ellipse even further, it opens up even more. If we go above our eye level, this is becoming taller and taller, then it starts to get convex. It's still an ellipse, but the upper part is getting rounded now. So based on eye level, the open aspect of the ellipse is either opening or closing, depending on how far above or how far below our eye level. So if our eye level is right at the top, this is going to be a straight line. If we're looking down on the subject, it's going to be one of these. If we're looking up at the subject, like a smokestack or something like this, then it's going to be rounded, upward, convex. Eye level determines the way that we distort this object. Just like in last week's foreshortening of the slices, we have a similar, not foreshortening, but distortion of this ellipse. Knowing this, we can create a more realistic 3D representation. Let's look at the teapot, which is a compound shape. It's got many different parts to it, and we'll just sketch it loosely here. That big shape is something like a circle, isn't it? Or an oval. Not a perfect circle, but like an oval. And this serves as the basis for our teapot. At the top, we recognize already, we're seeing it, a little ellipse up there where we pour the water into, the hot water. We see a little bit, if we have this without the cloth, we're going to see a foot. Almost all teapots have a foot because this is how they can keep the liquid warm, is elevate it a little bit. Two new things are the handle. The handle and spout are rather complex. They're difficult to draw because they have some curves to them, and it's just an unusual shape, so it's a little hard for us to draw. But we start by adding the lines of our handle, and one way we can think about this spout is to draw the point where it meets draw an ellipse where it meets the surface of the teapot, create that kind of bulging quality, and then extend that into these lines. Probably are the difficult lines, these curving, graceful lines that make the teapot. So and this is just one style of teapot. Of course, there's many styles. They all share some of these qualities, which is the body, the handle, and the spout. So the teapot that you have at home is going to probably require a little different structure. One thing I'm going to include that you don't see because it broke is the cap, the top that sits on the teapot. So this is what I mean by a complex shape. It's made up of a big shape, probably the most important part, and a complex shape on the side, another complex shape on this side, a little bit of a foot, which is rounded, and the spout, which does have a little ellipse, but not much. I'm sorry, the top opening. So this is the way that I approach the complex shape, is start with the big shape first, add the smaller parts, and I'm drawing very lightly in the beginning, gradually making it darker as I feel comfortable about my placement and the proportion. And then I'll lighten the lines before I start shading, or just shade right into that dark line. So far, so good. Let's do some shading and also some thoughts towards shadows. Well, let's turn the page. We don't mind. Let's do our cup, for example, by repeating this shape. We get really familiar with it, so it's a good idea. Okay, so we have our basic cup. Say the light is coming in this direction, a little above and from the right side. Our shadow, naturally, is going to come off the left side. So the light source is affecting a couple of things: the direction of the shadow, the length of the shadow, and the darkness of the shadow. So I've just drawn the shape at this point. The shape is reflective of the cup itself. As the light moves across the top, we're going to see it bright on this side and dark on this side, because some light is filling the cup. Let's just shade this rather quickly so that we can see how light affects the form, some basic qualities that we can look for. And using those basic qualities, we can create not only expression of the form, but an expression of the light itself, the quality of the light. A lot of that is expressed in the shadow. That's why this week we're talking about shadows so much. Okay, so I'm just going to use a vertical stroke in this case. Very dark on this side. As we come into the light, the color's getting lighter and lighter, because this side is away from the light. So already we can feel the light moving across the form. Let's do the same on the inside, but we're going to go very light back here and darker on this side. The foot is away from the light completely, so it's going to be quite dark, almost all the way through. Now the shadow, I'm going to use a little different angle to my stroke because I'm describing the flatness of the table with this stroke. The shadow's moving off to the left. That tells us the light's coming this way, reinforces this idea. And one thing I notice and I point out is that the shadow changes. It goes from a darker aspect where it's coming off of the object, whatever that object may be. As it moves to the left, it gets lighter and lighter. Where it meets the object, right here, is going to be the darkest part. And that should be reflected in your drawing. So you can see how that communicates a bit of the form of our cup and the motion of light. Let's say the light is coming from behind. We'll do one from behind. And we call this backlight, or if you want to say it in French, it's contre-jour. And it's a condition that artists like because it simplifies everything in one way. And our shadow is going to come off in this direction. Now it may be long, it may be short, depending on how low the light is. The side is going to be rather flat. I need to start on this side. Let's go once more. Because the light's behind our cup is going to be quite dark. Let's finish this off with that elliptical shape. Inside's going to be quite dark because it's against the light. I'm leaving a little highlight on the lip. The foot, again, quite dark. Rounded at the bottom. Very flat feeling, that's what I want. And then as the shadow comes off, same idea. I'm going to go with a flat stroke here as well. Today I'm using a mechanical pencil, which I can sharpen by using just a little bit of sandpaper. I like the 4B lead or 6B lead. And once again, it's going to get very dark where it meets the object. And as it comes outward, it's going to get progressively lighter. So we control that by overlapping strokes, returning to that bottom part and just making it darker, pulling it out, blending. This is foreshortened, so it's not as tall as the cup, but we want it to be as wide. And right where it meets the bottom of the cup, it's going to be quite, the bottom of the foot, it's going to be quite dark there. So this is presenting the scenario that light is coming from behind. And I'm going to introduce one more thing, which is the idea of light bounce. What light bounce means is that light is bouncing from a light surface, in this case the tablecloth, which is white or bright, bouncing back up into the cup. If the cup has a glossy finish or shiny finish, you will see this even more. Where light is bouncing up, you're going to see a bit of lightness near the bottom, the area that's closer to the white cloth. Light bounce. Light is bouncing up into that, making it feel a little brighter. We notice that on the teapot. We do notice it on the cup a little bit as well. So this is a backlit or contre-jour shading for the light behind, and the light is actually rather low in this case because the shadow is coming out quite far. Typically, we'll see the shadow a little differently. If the light is coming directly on our cup, let's do it once more. We're getting really familiar with this cup. There's nothing wrong with that because we're going to be drawing it in our subject today. If it's coming like over our shoulder and hitting the cup, it's going to look even different. So let's draw that here. We're going to shade it rather lightly. That means with a light touch. Except on the sides, we're going to get a little darker just on this edge of both sides. And inside the cup, it's going to be not as dark. It's going to be a little light. Could even be bright in the cup. Let's imagine it's bright in the cup in this instance. We're going to have to show a little bit of thickness to the edge. And a little thickness to, or a little darker in the color of the cup itself, to give that, make that effect work. So here I'm just lightly shading the sides on both sides, leaving the interior bright. Darker on the foot because it's still in the shadow of the cup, so it's still going to be dark down there, but not as dark as the other examples. So the light is hitting directly on our cup. And we'll see the shadow behind. Let's do it on this side just a little bit. So it's coming over our right shoulder and going behind the cup. In this fashion. So comparatively, you can start to feel the differences of how light affects the subject and what we need to do to, first in terms of observation, we want to make an observation of that light. And second, what we need to do when we start to execute it, whether we need to foreshorten it. Here it's very skinny because it's very foreshortened on the table. Here it's going back, so it's obscured. I'm talking about the shadow. So all these things play a role in your drawing, and when you can observe it, that's the first step. Being able to record it may take a little more time, record it to your satisfaction, but eventually it's just a matter of practice and repetition. Okay, so here we're playing with, this is the idea of shadow, and we're going to get into shadow quite a bit today. All right, so I'm looking at a couple images for my drawing. Let's do a thumbnail. Small study, remember, to get an idea of our composition. One thing I notice in this particular photograph is it forms a L composition, which is a great way to compose. It connects to your objects and gives the whole thing some stability. So let's just do this roughly. We have a vase here, flowers going up, reaching the top of the rectangle. We have the teapot at a profile, which is good, and we have the teacup just behind. all of this. So it forms a good composition. There's also the folds that come into the drawing are at a good location too, because they connect and they lead into our drawing. So let's imagine this as just simple shapes, what it's going to look like. Remember, all these shapes are kind of tied together, so it might look a little odd because it's just abstract shapes. But this does give us a clue and some thoughts as to how it's working as a composition. Overlapping objects, as we mentioned last week, is a good working thought. So this is a nice composition. Let's look at a couple others. This is another one which is a little not so good. Why is it not so good? Because everything falls in one line. There's got a feeling that everything is placed too accurately. So what I mean by that is there's a little plate with oranges leading to our teapot, leading to the flowers, so they all rest on this line, this invisible line kind of going up. It does form an L. So there is, there's some debate here whether it's really composition, and in the long run you're going to make that decision. You're going to say, this speaks to me, I want to work with this, and you're going to develop your drawing. So that's part of the reason we do this little thumbnail sketch, is to see these things and see if we like what's going on, or whether it feels sort of static or maybe a little uninteresting. I don't know. I'm not convinced of this one. Let's look at another one. Sometime I'll take a photo of composition that's perhaps not so good. Let's see what this one looks like. Big shape here, smaller shape, another shape here, little space between, some really beautiful shadows coming off this shape. I like this composition just for the shadow. When you get more experienced, you are able to move things based on what you would like to see, and not necessarily place them, but adjust their position in a convincing way. we're working with still life, so we'll, for the moment, we'll kind of stay with that. And I do like this little tulip hanging over. I think that's a nice touch. Here the shadow kind of comes out from our objects and falls along some of the folds in an interesting way. Give us a chance to play with more shadows in this case. Could be good, could be good. Let's look at one more. This is interesting. This would be more of a vertical. So that means our teapot and other objects are going to be made smaller. Let's see what this looks like. We'll put our vase about here. And teapot here, an intersecting cup about here. A difficult view of the teapot because it's pointing right at us. From a point of view of the shadow, this is perhaps the most interesting. This is that backlit condition that we talked about, that we practiced earlier. The light is coming from behind. This certainly does present the shadows in a very interesting way. They become as important as the objects themselves. Everything is made a little smaller, which I tend to not like. Let's look at one more just for good measure. Could be interesting too. Has the same sort of shadow pattern. Here our cup is to the right a little bit. Nice staggering of elements, and then we do have Some beautiful shadow play. Well, either one could be good, any one of these. But I want to focus on shadows today, so perhaps this one is going to be good. This composition follows what's called a inverted styliard. So sort of a scale coming down from the top, bouncing left against right, the centerpiece, and then an object to the right, a mass to the right, and a mass to the, left and right. This one is closer to that vertical, this one further away. So it's a styliard, which is a scale basically. And I think could be a good subject for us. We'll get to play with shadows, we'll get to play with the pattern of the cloth, objects. I'm drawing a little bit more of a square version, so I'm making a little border that allows me to do that. And then I'll start to place the objects by shape. Simple shapes first. Slightly off center. Looking for the bottom of my objects. Each one is a little different position. The top as well. Perhaps the biggest in this case is become the vase. The top part coming about here. Make it a little shorter. Then in addition to that, some of these folds they have nice directionals, kind of leading us naturally into the center or the focal point created by the shadows. So I'm loosely stating the object. You notice how light the lines are. Holding the pencil by the back. Using my arm to kind of create the motion. Okay, something like that. Let's put in the ellipses. This is kind of coming out to the side, isn't it? It's slightly turned. 3/4 profile. Handle slightly inset. I realize you might need more time to get the shapes the way you like them, but you'll have that time later. Okay. Big shoulders on this vase. Oval for the head of the tulip, which is not quite opened yet. And as I'm placing these shapes, I'm also looking at the shape between, or a common term is the negative shape. These are very useful shapes as well when you're trying to get proportion or a specific measurement. This is a good case right here. Looking at the space between to get some accuracy. Okay, let's do the first stage, which I want to kind of loosely shade the objects. They're against the light, which is, I feel, sort of an advantage because I can be, the objects themselves are a little flatter. And because they're flatter, they're easier to shade, they're easier to and I like that flatness to it. I feel it makes it more mysterious and interesting. So we develop preferences certainly as we start to do more and more work. And those likes and dislikes certainly are going to figure into the sort of lighting that you render, the sort of objects you choose, all of that. I'm going to start with the I'll start on the right hand side here, and I'm going to use kind of a flat stroke initially. Even though there's a lot of movement and divisions. within all of these leaves. I am looking to create some interesting spaces, but I want to keep the stroke rather simple at the moment. Again, this is kind of born out of personal preference as much as anything. I think we all have a little bit of a different way of going about it. My first goal, and what I would like you to try and do, is get a statement of the likeness, the similarity in the tones. Later on, we'll distinguish them and make them a little more varied. But in the beginning, it's not a bad idea. And this subject suits the idea to keep it sort of uniform. So that's what I'm doing here. Looking for some interesting negative shapes to come out of this as well. And I see a lot of tonal variation, which I'm sort of ignoring right now. I'll come back to that. Since since it's very dark in this section, there's no problem with coming back and getting a little darker. So you see I'm kind of using a similar stroke through all of this, sort of a angled stroke. And I know that the leaves are showing much more variation than this. But I do this because, number one, it's a little easier physically. And two, I know I'm going to get darker, and at that point I'll start to vary the angle of my stroke a little more. For now, I'm just trying to keep it simple, paying attention on where there's gaps in the leaves, breaks in the leaves. I like working this way and building up the masses first, so I can get an idea of the similarities in the tonality, the connections in the shape, and either leave them or hide them as I move forward in developing the drawing, or exaggerate them. And this becomes the cup. The cup becomes a shadow. my first shadow. Nice long shadows. Even the top of the cup. I might leave a little white for a highlight. And then we start to connect the teapot. One of the more difficult shapes. We kind of started with this vertical, so and this becomes another fold. And a big shadow here. So at this stage, I find it very good time to kind of step back and see how the shapes are progressing. Am I way off in anything? Can I see how to fix it? If I'm not, then I just continue on in the same fashion. But I think you see the value of keeping them all sort of in a similar tone at this stage. So we can kind of appraise it as an abstract shape. And is it interesting? Yes, it's very interesting. The way the shape kind of grows out of the center, has a lot of ins and outs along the edges. There is a kind of almost like a grouped mass type effect here. Another compositional stem is a grouped mass. Reaches to both sides of the paper. Again, I think this is why I like this light that's behind our subject. Should I put the top? I'm contemplating making the top slightly ajar. This is a teapot that I've had a long time, so I know what the top itself broke some years ago. But I remember it well, so it's really easy to put it back. All right, let's pause for just a second. Step back, see how it's going. And from this point, we start to get darker. Okay. Let's continue. Probably a good idea to start some of our darkest parts and work outward. The teapot is quite dark. I'm going to start down here. And start to build in some of that roundness. time-consuming, this process of building up the tone. But no choice, really. Getting some of that light bounce to happen in the center here of the pot. It's very reflective, highly reflective. So we're going to see a lot of that. So the folds start off as lines, but we need to start to shade them to give them a three-dimensional quality at some point. And that's what I'm doing now, working into the shadows. The fold basically is a valley, and so we need to create a bright spot for the rise in the valley. We do that by shading in the lower part of the valley. Still using this horizontal stroke in my folds. But I'm primarily focused on the shape of the folds, not the detail, primarily the shape. I know I can get the detail in the last stage. Here will be just a little darker at the bottom of this fold. And since it's a soft material, all these edges, we should try to make them soft if possible. On the other side of this is a slight tone. And that's how we get it to feel like it's a rising and falling. Remember, as our shadow comes out, it's getting a little lighter. Right near the bottom of the cup is going to be very dark. Right here. And I'm going to darken the inside a little bit. Here I'll give it a little bit of an edge. Trying to preserve a little light on that edge if I can. I avoid the decorative quality of the glaze until the end when I want to get some nuance. For this stage, I'm primarily concerned with getting feeling of the light and shadow. So if you notice, this does have some light bounce on the right side and the left side of the cup. It's very subtle. Unless you're looking for it, you'll probably miss it, but it is there. So I'm going to create that through the center of this cup and let the light kind of bounce off the sides. And then I'm going to get dark again through here, blend it into the front. This is almost my darkest dark. A little darker towards the bottom center of the interior. And I'm going to take a little break here. Before getting into the glass. All right, we're beginning to add darks to our shapes and create the feeling of a dramatic light. Here I'm adding a little bit of light bounce to the cup by going a little darker up above, through here, through the lip, And in the lower section, I'm keeping it light so that we feel like the white cloth is bouncing some light up into the cloth. The same is true in our teapot, which we have pretty well established. I'm going to build up some obvious darks, and then as it comes to a finish, I'm going to probably add one more strength of darkness across the teapot to make it feel a deeper color, and also increase the feeling of light bounce. So even though we're seeing these objects in a strong shadow, within that shadow there's a lot of stuff happening too. The camera is not so great for picking this up. Our vision is stronger in this sense, and we're able to, when we look in the shadows, see a lot more going on than the camera or the photograph reveals. And we can also go beyond what the camera or photograph reveals. And by that I mean start to use your imagination or your sense of, expression. If you want to use a strong dark, stronger than you see, it's a good idea to experiment with that and see what happens. Well, I've gotten started here. I'm going to see this through. We're adding a bit of dark to the teapot, and by so doing we make that reflective quality even stronger. I try to blend it in what I've already placed. There we go, getting even darker. Make that cup come forward. So that's quite a bit of an exaggeration from what we see, and I'm going to leave it in this stage. I may at some point return and mute this exaggeration, but for right now I'm going to kind of leave it here. In fact, I'm even going to get darker. This is one of the nice things about working with graphite, and one of the frustrating things at the same time is it just takes a long time to build up the darks that we need. A lot of returning to the subject and pressing even harder, getting more dark on top of the drawing that you've already placed. I'm just going to mute this a little bit through the front. There we go. Something like that. And I'm still using that stroke that basically circumvents the roundness of the form, expresses a roundness to the pot. Okay, going well. Let's establish this dark a little more. Right through here. You see me using a little different pencil this week. This week it's still graphite. This is a 4B, which is a little harder than I usually work. But I've been whittling away these wooden pencils, and I'm looking for something that somehow doesn't require me to sharpen as much. And this is a good substitute, a little more ecologically minded too. We're not using any wood here. It's just the body that holds a lead. Other than that, there's no real differences. Okay, let's shape this a little better. we can pull lights back out, reshape our shadow a little bit, make it run along the edges a little more. Anyway, we proceed. I'm going to finish off this top because it's a little distracting. So unfortunately, you can't really see the top. I'm seeing it in my mind's eye, what I remember it to look like. And so I have an advantage because I've worked with this teapot so often that I know what the top looks like roughly. I'm making it rest slightly ajar, so there's a little interest there. Okay. Let's leave it like that. Come back here. And some nice dark into our handle. To the cup. So these objects are feeling pretty good. I think we can get a little darker perhaps in the shadow. Right. A little darker in this shadow. We'll keep tweaking it until we're really happy with it. As you can tell, I'm really fond of shadows. I like the way they work for not only creating the light that we're describing, which is very important, crucial in fact, but they also bring a great design element to your drawing when you can use shadows, for example, to connect shapes to the top and bottom of your drawing or span spaces between the objects in your drawing. They have even more value. So yes, they are shadows, but they can be very important design tools also. And that's why one reason I chose the backlight in today's subject is so we can see that in effect, how we use this exaggerated extension of the shadow to create a more beautiful design. More beautiful, more dynamic. To me, they're sort of the same thing, but they're not. That doesn't mean the same to everybody. All right. Time to work in the vase. Let's start by placing the level of water. I'm going to go just a little higher into the vase, just above the cup, and start to work down. And I'm very conscious, I see a ton of leaves, of course, but I'm trying to see them as a mass, a big mass. And so I'm going to render them very flat in the beginning here. and focus on the spaces between. Or we call those negative spaces, negative shapes, shapes formed by positive elements, in this case stems and leaves. You can see one right there, very important one. I love that little peekaboo of light through here. A couple more up above. And variety is always our helper. If we remember variety, we almost don't have to remember anything else. Variety, variety. So we're doing little shapes here, little shapes between objects, looking for variety of size and angle, trying to avoid making them too much the same. Something like that. If they start looking too much the same, you can easily make one smaller, another larger. Let's work in the top part. The top part. First, let's make an observation where these meet the water. These stems, most of them are kind of back here. Some of them come a little lower. And from there we can get much darker. We'll keep that little space where they meet. Here I'm starting to be a little more aware of the variety of shapes. I'm not following it implicitly. But I just want to break it up a little bit. And the little magic starts to come out. This is the ellipse that's very flat, the top of our vase, compared to the ones that are more open. Still using that same stroke. Not really varying the stroke. I'm relying more on tonal distinction to create the various shapes within shapes. For example, here we go a lot darker. And by doing that, we create a shape within a shape, a nested shape. And I'm sort of relying now on what my eye is seeing in my sketch, because I've already alluded to these things. And I do this instead of watching the drawing, the photograph too much. back and see how it's going. Appears to be going okay. Can even put our handle coming through the vase. Here's a point where we need a little clarity because I'm going to make it going behind this vase. That. Just be a little bigger space on the side. I'll get a little highlight there a little later. And we'll keep building up here. It's a nice forward bending leaf here. It will leave light. Making sense out of chaos. And what helps me to do that, I believe, is just being able to see the shapes, the spaces between shapes, and sort of believe that these are going to make a semblance of leaves falling into a vase. I know from experience it really doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, I think perfection is often the reason the drawing feels lifeless or unmotivated, as it's every edge is accounted for, and too much like a photograph, no room for our imagination. Hope nobody's a photographer. I hope I haven't offended any photographers. Okay, keep going. Finish off this upper part. Again, concentrating on the shapes and the spaces between the shapes. Keeping it rather flat because this is just, I want to keep the feeling of an abstract in this section. I don't want to get too bogged down in any detail or even nuance. I just wanted to exit the paper in a interesting way. And the cropping that we made on the image, I think, portrays that. It's giving me a good sense of that pattern of leaves and stems up here. We continue. Boy, they really love to blow those horns. By making this a little bit darker and showing how the stem is inset, I can make it feel like it's going back in space. It's almost like a concert out there. Who can play louder? The ambulance or the fire truck? Fire truck always wins. Okay. So we're getting into smaller and smaller areas, darker and darker areas. We're finding that we're really having to press hard on the pencil now. But look at the unity starting to come out. I have a little softer pencil here that might be more appropriate. Even though this is a white cloth, the shadow part is quite dark. This could be, if I want to express that red color, much, much darker. But graphite really won't get as dark as we need. Charcoal, yes. Graphite gives us a very strong mid-tone, but doesn't give us the black or the deeper shades that we need. Okay, that's pretty close. Let's blend this a little more, make it a little more flat and even. So sometimes we shade, sometimes we polish. And I feel like I'm polishing now with the broad side of this pencil, trying to fill in the whites, make it feel a little smoother, and by doing that I make it feel a little softer as well. Not a lot though. Some of you are much better at that than me. Oops. I like this big fold back here. See how these folds help us to carry the composition side to side. We can even put more back there. I don't think that's necessary. Well, let's put some decorative elements. We're going to make it rise. This is the sort of striping that we see. It's a little offset. This also is going to make our shadows feel somewhat transparent. It's fun. We'll start with some of these major darks, and then we might or we may not add the smaller ones. This angle is also, I feel, good for our still life. It counters a lot of other angles. As these lines go back in space, they get closer together. Don't worry about being too perfect with this. Our eye helps to make it feel correct, even if we're off. Okay, let's use this area to create a little foreshortening. So as these go back, repeating lines, repeating shapes in essence, and they get closer together. This gives the illusion that the table's going back in space. Here they open up or become further apart.